Hi folks, hope you're safe and well. So, boy, did we set the humour web on fire with our last video on why we prefer to use specific types of blunt longsword trainer over feathers. Now, I wasn't going to do another video on this since I've made my points and I stand by those points. I don't think they need clarification, although some of them perhaps need some expansion. So I'm going to attempt to expand on some of those reasons in a moment, and I've got a couple of training blunts here to help demonstrate that. One of the things I wanted to quickly cover was this being a kind of a type of response to Matt Easton of Scholagladiatoria. You know, if anybody's sort of watching this because they think I'm going to shit talk him or anything like that, then that's not that. You know, this isn't that kind of video. Matt and I have been acquaintances for a very long time. We're not best friends or anything. We mix in different HEMA circles, but yeah, we've actually trained together. When Matt was with the Exiles in the late 90s, early 2000s, we actually trained together. So I have a lot of respect for him and what he does. But there was one thing on a video which he's just done off the back of all the noise at the moment around using blunts over using feathers and vice versa. And there's something that he says in his video I do think he's a little bit cautious with his video. I think he's a little bit on the fence. That's just my feeling from the video. But there's one thing that he says specifically, which is around the idea of why is it a debate? Why is it an argument? And for the most part, I agree. It doesn't need to be a debate. People are going to have preferences. I do think, though, that people are entitled to those preferences, and I think a little bit of credit should be given when people are making their choices of training weapon. So, as I say, this isn't a kind of response to Scholagladiatoria, but just on the premise of, you know, him saying, why is it a debate? Why does it come up? Why does it matter? Again, I'm hoping that with this video, I can explain my perspective on why it might matter to some and why it might not matter to others. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do with this video. So first up, some clarifications then. So with my first video, that was a video on why we choose to use blunt, specific types of blunt longsword trainer over most types of feather. Now, it wasn't a video on the pros and cons of each, and it wasn't a video on the benefits of one over the other or anything like that. It was a video because we are repeatedly asked, and we were asked in the video before that video that I did on why we use blunts. In the comments, we were asked again, why do we not use feathers? So I specifically addressed that question in my video. In terms of the reasons I gave, I do stand by all of those reasons. There was a couple that you know, people got really hung up on, and I'd like to use this opportunity to clarify exactly what I meant. I think for the most part, groups that train with the same sort of mentality that we do, again, it's our mentality, it's how we like to train. I'm certainly not saying it's how everybody should train, but it's our preference. We train to get as close to the art as we possibly can, given modern constraints. And again, I will expand on that in a moment. I think a lot of groups, you know, very established groups, you know, a lot of people have messaged me, I've been speaking to others, they agree with the reasons of my video. Not all of them, I'll hold my hands up to that, but they generally would agree. So the first point I want to cover is the fact that I'm generalizing. Okay, when I say the blunts that we use versus most feathers, I was very careful in my video to hopefully give the impression that yes, of course I'm generalizing. I said, I think more than once, that I'm talking about common types of feather. I'm talking about some of the examples that we see, which are incredibly long, incredibly bendy, very whippy. And I actually sense checked myself with this. I thought, well, how common are these things? So I did a YouTube search. I looked up HEMA tournaments and HEMA sparring, and 13 out of the 15 videos that appeared in that search were of the types of feathers that I'm talking about. In fact, in Matt's video, he shows 3 different types of feathers, and 2 of the 3 are, in my view, too bendy for what we do, and all 3 of them have a shield. Okay, and I'm going to talk about those in a second. So I did sense check myself, and I feel completely you know, fine to generalize about feathers. This is the thing about generalization, because everybody's doing it. In Matt's video, he says that feathers are safer than blunts. He's generalizing. Okay, I think we can all accept that. when other people have been commenting, and bearing in mind the discussion around this video has generated way more interest in the actual video itself, just to be clear, because we have a very small channel. But everybody's generalising. People are wading in and they're saying, well, you know, feathers are much safer than blunts. They're generalising, okay? Because not all feathers are safer than all blunts. And I acknowledge that in my video. I say, for what we do, for our preference, there are pros and cons for each. I also say that feathers are a perfectly legitimate training tool, okay? They absolutely are. In my personal view, my preference is that they are not suited to the works of Fiori when you look at the system in its entirety, and that's a really important point which I'll come on to in a second, but they are a legitimate training tool. And I was simply giving my view as to why they don't specifically suit how we like to train. Just to be really, really clear, this is not just limited to feathers. There are some types of reproduction longsword blunt trainer that also are not suitable for how we like to train, okay? And hopefully with the examples I give, and so I'm going to give some technical examples, I'm going to show some videos of us doing plays where hopefully you will see a little bit more about where I'm coming from. So the first point to cover is what kind of blunts do we like to use? Well, I have two examples here, okay? I have what I personally, and it's my preference, I have what I consider to still be the gold standard for the type of training that we do and the type of approach we do. This is an Albion Lichtenauer. It's stiff, yeah, I mean, it doesn't have a shilt, and it handles, for a blunt, reasonably well when you compare it to a similar profile of sharp, both modern reproduction and historical examples, of which we've handled loads. We've done our time with all of that. This is still, for me, the gold standard, okay? I'm also running this. It's a VB, slightly customised, predominantly due to how my preferences have changed because of hand injuries and stuff. It does have a huge taper. It does have a safe-ish tip on it. I mean, it does have narrow cross guards, which suit me because of how my hands move, because of those injuries that I've mentioned in previous videos. It also has quite a long hilt on it. This is kind of by it, to be honest. Some, you know, period examples have really long hilts. Some of them don't. That sort of stuff is kind of irrelevant, to be honest. This would look like it's quite bendy. It's actually not. It's actually quite a stiff weapon. It's bending in the very last little bit, and that's kind of what we would expect. If you look at some of the examples in the manuscripts that Fiori shows, some of these things go really long, really pointy, so we would expect the last portion of it to be, of most of them, to be reasonably flexible. I'm going to talk about why flexibility is important in a second. But before I do, let's just talk about the length. So, look, this is the thing about when we look at modern reproductions, modern training swords, and indeed historical examples. There is a temptation from some, especially newer to HEMA, to think that because we are modelling a sword on something that may be in a museum, it was a standard length, okay? That's not the case, okay? If you're, you know, a student of Fiori's and you're 6.5 foot tall, you're probably going to be able to afford to have a sword made for yourself, and you're probably going to have it a little bit longer than someone who's 5'5", okay? So just because we see examples of specific length, it doesn't mean that that was like the standard of the period, okay? They come in all different lengths, all different shapes, all different sizes, and again, you can see this in the manuscript, okay? Fiori actually makes reference to this. He specifically mentions several times about having a longer sword, okay? Or this is better if you have a longer sword. There is a cut-off though. It's very important to mention that we study Amazari, okay? So we are looking at the entirety of the system, which means we're not just thinking about using these things with two hands, okay? We're not just thinking about the dynamics of two-handed sword combat. We're also thinking about using the same weapon with one hand, okay? And the same weapon half-swording, because it is the same weapon that we're thinking of, okay? That we're looking at, that we need to be looking at. So we're thinking of all of that, okay? And then length becomes really important, okay? And I'm going to show a video now as to why having a sword that's very, very long, like some of the examples that we see of feather, why that's actually detrimental to how we like to study the system. So let me show that video now.
The same again. Here, if I want to use the point instead, I can come up under his armpit. Yeah? And if he sort of bends, grab it, take it down. Turn around. Same sort of card, bang. Yeah? I can hook this here under the armpit and effectively take it that way.
Okay, so what you're seeing in that video is a principle from Fury's works. Okay, it's from the Armoured section. Effectively, you're using the point of the thing to come in against the opponent, either arm high, and you're basically looking to stick the point under their armpit and give them a turn. Now, that has a number of challenges when we start looking at some examples of very long, very bendy feder. The first one is that if it's really stupid long, you're actually going to struggle to have a reasonable grip, a reasonable half sword grip without being wide like this. You're actually going to struggle to find the armpit with the point because it's going to be too long. Okay, bearing in mind it's going to basically be over their shoulder. Okay, so I'm going to come under their armpit and give them a turn. Now, if this is a ridiculously long weapon, blunt or feder, that's going to be a technique that you're going to really struggle to apply. The second thing, which comes down to the flexibility aspect, is the fact that when I've got this point under their armpit, I need to basically turn to put them to ground. Now, if my weapon is particularly bendy, particularly flexible, I'm going to struggle. And you can see from that video, even with a fairly stiff longsword trainer, a longsword blunt, Mark in the video has to actually adjust his grip. He has to reach over and back onto the top of the weapon to finish off that throw. So it's already difficult enough with a very stiff trainer, let alone something that's very, very bendy and flexible. So that's example number one. Now, just to be clear, with a technique like in the video I've just shown, and I'll show it more in a second, you know, I personally would be happy to make that work with a feder. The thing here is it's about choice, okay? I could probably make it work with a feder, but it's about success rates, okay? It's less likely to be successful. I'm less likely to put my opponent to ground with a weapon that there's no evidence for Fury using. So, you know, again, another one of the reasons that I gave. Let's stick with this flexibility thing, okay, for just a moment. I want to show another video. I actually had a discussion around this, okay, which is around breaking, the principle that Fury gives us around breaking cuts and thrusts, okay? Now, Fury's very specific about this, and I've talked about this in other videos, but he specifically says with breaking the thrust, this is sword in two hands now, although I'll expand on that again as well in a second, but he specifically says to draw the arms higher and to cut at your opponent's mezza spada. That's with cut or thrust, okay? Now, mezza spada is the middle of my opponent's sword, okay? And it doesn't matter where I'm coming from, what posture I'm coming from, but effectively I'm coming offline and I'm doing a fendente action at their cut or thrust, and I'm aiming for their mezza spada. Flexibility is important with an action like this for a multitude of reasons. One, I'm aiming to hit their mezza spada with my punta, okay, with the very end of my weapon, okay. The reason why I'm doing that is because it's governed by distance, okay. If I'm close enough to cut mezza to mezza, so the middle of my sword to the middle of theirs, there's a very high likelihood that I will actually break their fendente into my own body because I'm close. If I'm close enough to hit the middle of their sword with the middle of mine, I'm close enough where that deflection that I'm looking for on their sword can come onto my body, can hit me, okay? If I'm closer still, I can hit their arms, and that's a different, you know, it's entirely valid, but it's a different principle, it's a different set of plays. Now, again, what suits us for this is a stiffer type of longsword, okay, a stiffer type of longsword trainer. Then we did breaks, okay, and I showed break earlier on. That's a break. I'm breaking the path of that weapon. I mean, that's not how you enter that play, but so on and so forth, okay? Well, I've touched on this individually, but when you're breaking, stick your sword out. It's punta to mezza spada. End of my sword, the middle of his, okay? Very important. With, again, generalising, most types of feder, we will not get the breaking action that we are looking for. Bearing in mind, from that breaking action, you're looking to put your opponent's weapon to ground, okay? And the reason why we know this is because the follow-on play shows you standing on your opponent's weapon. Again, if we're looking at very light, very flexible training weapons, it's going to be that much more difficult to achieve that kind of action, to get the break that I'm looking for, to put it to ground in a way that I can then stand on that weapon. It's possible with a feder, with most types of feder, but again, it's taking away a little bit from what we're trying to achieve. We want to try and recreate this art with the tools that we believe are the closest to what we would have been training with in the period as well. So that's another point. I said I would expand on the point around, you know, that example of breaking the cut or thrust of your opponent. I was doing it from a two-handed perspective. You can also do it from a one-handed perspective as well, and we need to be able to do that. So I've got the sword in one hand, it's the same sword, I'm just now using it one-handed, and my opponent may be one or two-handed on their weapon, or they may be using a spear or a poleaxe. Now you can imagine that if they have a spear, or certainly a poleaxe, it becomes that much more important for me to use my punter to break that weapon to ground, because again, the risk, there's so much mass on the end of a poleaxe that the risk of trying to break that, you know, I want to be at a distance where I'm not going to break it into myself. Okay. Also, this is where the mass on the tip of the weapon becomes really important too. Again, with most types of fedder, the mass is down by the hands. Okay, so I don't have the mass in the end of the weapon to actually get a good break a lot of the time either. So possible, but more challenging. So that's another consideration. Now, if people want to argue with that, it's actually an interpretation argument. Okay, you can say, well, we wouldn't hit Metz Espada, we don't, but that's an interpretation argument. That's an entirely different argument. Okay, the point I'm coming from with this is that for how we like to do that kind of play, we prefer a stiffer longsword trainer than you would find, you know, for most common types of fedder, right? The next part is around the shield, okay, and Matt quite rightly says in his video, it's of course possible to make a fedder-like blunt longsword trainer without a shield. It's entirely possible, and I believe he actually said that he's working on something along those lines. Look, I mean, this VB, but one thing it doesn't have is a shield. Now let's talk about this real quick. Again, I don't need to be too exhaustive. There's a multitude of reasons why a shield is useful on a training weapon. Predominantly, it brings a bit of weight into the thing. It helps you turn the thing a bit quicker. It's pulling the mass down the blade, but predominantly it's there to protect your hands, to protect your fingers. Okay, so let me use this as a really good example of, again, why we would prefer a blunt longsword trainer over a fedder. Okay, it's because of the shield. All right, there is actions within the manuscript, how we interpret them, where a shield actually makes it easier. It makes it easier to accomplish those actions. The example I'm thinking of here is from the stretto section, the close plays of Fury's works, where he comes in, he meets in Crusada right foot forward, and the action described is to lift the opponent's weapon. Okay, so you're using your crossguard to lift the opponent's weapon, which gives us options. Okay, it gives us the option to take hold of their weapon and to take it behind them. It gives us the option to push their arms aside and pull on the thrust. It gives us options. Okay, but let's just consider this very carefully. With a blunt longsword trainer, okay, because I don't have a shield, I'm actually catching it as I would with a period sharp. Okay, I'm catching it between blade and between cross. So their blade is right down on my strong, okay? Which means to action that technique, I need to be very careful about how I do it, okay? So we know from practice, from experience, I can't just lift my arms straight up, because what happens is I catch my opponent's weapon across the back of my hand. Now this is not a meaningful, you know, cut, okay? It's not going to do me any damage, but it's still going to make contact with the back of my hand. So if their sword is here, right on my cross, and I'm to action this play, I'm just lifting my hands up, I'll catch up the back of my hands, okay? What I should be doing, again, our interpretation is I'm lifting, but I'm pushing forward, okay? Which keeps my hands protected from their weapon being against my crossguard, okay? Now with a shield, I will catch their weapon higher up, won't I? Which means it's an easier play for me to action, because I can just lift my arm straight up. I don't need to worry about, you know, their sword dropping down onto my fingers, especially if they try and pull it back, if they try and recover. You know, I've got that much more safety. So in some respects you could argue, because I'm using a tool which Fury doesn't show, which there's no evidence of him using, a tool which makes the technique I'm given easier for me to accomplish, you could argue I'm not being true to my mission statement of getting as close as I possibly can to Fury's works, okay? I'm using the same tool, or at least a very similar tool to what I think he was using, okay? I don't want to cheat. I don't want a modern, you know, training weapon, or a historical base training weapon that come much later than Fury. You know, I don't want that to dilute how I'm training, okay? Because again, my objective is to get as close to the art as I possibly can, and I think having a shield on the weapon is cheating. So that's another reason why, from a technical perspective, fedders do not suit what we do. ducked into the home office. It's a bit windy outside, so I thought I'd finish this up in here. So the next part is around safety. I acknowledged in my first video, and I'm happy to still acknowledge that if the argument is around safety, if some people are coming from the perspective of, you know, using feathers from a safety perspective, then I can respect that, and I get that. You know, I don't fully agree with it. I think safety is more to do with the conditions of your training. I think safety is also to do with the individuals, control, etc., etc. But in some instances, I understand if you're going to a tournament and you're sparring against someone who you've never met before, you know, you can't vouch for their safety. Accidents inevitably will happen. Of course they will. You know, so I get it. You know, a lot of people that have messaged me or said publicly that they are the same also run very large clubs, and you know, we've never had an issue with safety, and collectively between us and the other guys, you know, you're talking about thousands of students that have come through and used blunts, and you know, certainly from our perspective, and indeed, you know, having visited these other clubs and worked with these other instructors, you know, there's certainly no, I don't think anybody has ever come to an Exiles event or seen us do anything and say that we're not intense, that we have to hold back, you know, because of our blunts, that we're not being safe because of our blunts, etc., etc. So I do think the question of safety and the argument of safety is a little bit more complex than just the tool. But again, I'm totally happy to concede that if that's the first and foremost consideration, of course it is for us too, but if that's where the argument is coming from, we use feathers because we feel that they're safer, then power to you. You know, I don't know how people train, I don't know what their approach is, I don't know how much experience is required before some of their students are put into these tournaments, you know, so I get the safety argument, but for us it's a balance. Okay, we are unquestionably a very safe club, but we are also, you know, unquestionably our aim is to get as close to the art as we possibly can, and there has to be a balance. But some people can't have it both ways. People can't in the same paragraph issue a blanket statement where they're saying that feathers are safer than blunts, but at the same time say that there's no differences. Okay, if they're different enough to be safer, then surely there's room to be different enough where some people aren't going to suit them for how they train. Even Matt does this in his videos. He clearly says, you know, feathers are safer, okay, but then goes on to say he's not sure why there's a debate around pros and cons of each. Well, again, you can't have it both ways. If they're safer, they're obviously different, okay? And again, it goes back to the generalisation piece. We're all generalising, so perhaps people can also forgive me for doing exactly the same. The last thing to say really is, again, like with the first video, I said it's horses for courses. This is just a choice, and I'll say again, the first video on this that we put out wasn't pros and cons. It wasn't what people should be doing. It was based on a question of us, why we prefer to use blunts over feathers. And again, I was generalising, okay? I think we've all been guilty of generalising. I think if people want to find issues with something, they will, okay? And probably people will find issues to this video as well. But again, we have to give each other some credit. I respect the views of other people. I have spent time justifying my views, and that's fine too. If I'm putting out videos, if I'm showing those videos, then of course I expect discussion. It's welcome. I always say nobody ever moved forward in HEMA without discussion, without debate, without taking on new ideas, and so all of that is absolutely welcome. I just figured this video would be useful just to mop up a couple of pieces. I didn't expect quite so much discussion around the first video. I certainly didn't expect a minority, but nevertheless I didn't expect some people to get arguably as offended as they did, you know, and that certainly wasn't the intention. I knew doing a video like that would put us in a little bit of hot water because this seems to be a very passionate subject, and to Matt's point, it does come up all the time and it does repeatedly come up. At the end of the day, it's not a point to argue about, okay? It's my job to put out a video and where I need to justify my reasoning. It's other people's job to present their views and justify those views, but it doesn't need to be a point of contention as such. It just needs to be that we accept each other's views and approaches, and that is of course the beauty of HEMA. There's no one size fits all. We all do it for different reasons, and that's what makes this thing special. So I've probably gone on for a bit longer than I expected to, but that I always do that with videos anyway. It's the last I'll say on the subject, at least for the time being, because I'd like to return to our normal order of service, which is just the martial stuff. I don't like the HEMA politics. That's not really what this channel's about. So yeah, I'll get cracking on the next video, next martial arts video. Thanks everybody.